and I'm sharing time with a number of colleagues, including Rose Conway-Walsh. Laskin Corla, as members of the Dáil will know, last year during the second lockdown, many universities moved to remote learning, and as a consequence, students who had prepaid for student accommodation or who were in student accommodation in or near campus had to vacate their licences early. And because students do not have the same protections under the Residential Tenancies Act as other renters when it comes to exiting from licence agreements early, many students and their families were significantly out of pocket. There is a widespread practice of students being required to pay 3 months, 6 months, and in some cases the full 9 months' rent in advance of taking up their student accommodation. And that meant thousands of families across the state lost substantial sums of money because there was no requirement for student landlords to repay that funds. And of course, many of these families themselves were very hard hit by COVID. They were on the PUP payment, the wage subsidy scheme, and were themselves experiencing hardship. So the loss of, in some cases, 3, 6 and 9,000 euros was a great financial blow for the families in question. If these had been standard private rental tenancies, the tenants could have given a 28-day notice. They would have foregone those 4 weeks' rent, but they would have had any rent prepaid beyond that period refunded. The Union of Students of Ireland rightly complained that students weren't being given fair play at the time, and they contacted both the Minister for Housing and opposition housing spokespeople, and they urged us to change the law to give students the protections they so rightly deserve. I know the Minister met with the Union of Students of Ireland and he has always engaged constructively with them on these and related matters, and myself and other opposition politicians did likewise. Those engagements on the opposition side led to the bill before us today. And it is a USI bill. It is designed by USI, it is led by USI, and it has the support of 56 deputies in the opposition who have co-signed the bill, and I believe others who have not signed it will also be supporting it here today. The bill does 3 very simple things, 2 of which are COVID-19 related protections, and 1 is a permanent change to the protections for students. The first is if a student is in student accommodation and is forced to leave that accommodation early because of future COVID-19 restrictions, they will be able to, as all other tenants do, give a 28-day notice and get refunded for any additional rent paid in advance beyond that 28-day notice period. Likewise, if a student is not able to take up pre-booked accommodation for similar COVID-19 restrictions, they too will be able to issue a 28-day notice to exit that licence early and will be fully refunded for anything beyond that period. And we think these are very fair and eminently sensible changes. The landlord will get their 28 days rent covered, and anything beyond that will be fully refunded. The permanent change, however, this bill proposes is that, in fact, the practice of pre-charging students for 3, 6 or 9 months should be ended. It is simply an unfair burden, particularly on working families in many parts of Ireland who are sending their sons and daughters to universities in the cities and towns, that they have to come up with such large amounts of cash when, again, regular renters in general pay a month's rent and a month's rent deposit. This bill has undergone very detailed assistance from the Office of Parliamentary Legal Advice, and we'd like to thank them for their work on this. And really, I suppose, the core message of this is let's give students fair play. Let's ensure that student renters are given exactly the same protections as all others. Obviously, if a landlord is being served with an early notice of termination, they get their 4 months. That is good enough in the private rental sector. Generally, it should be good enough for student landlords. But equally, students get the fair play of refunds beyond that. And crucially, once we get to the other side of COVID, the practice of requiring the prepayment of thousands and thousands of euros for hard-pressed working families comes to an end. I think it's a reasonable bill, I think it's a sensible bill, and I would urge the Minister, as he has done previously in opposition, in fairness to him, on protecting students, work with us in opposition and pass the USI bill to give students fair play. Thank you, Laskin Corla.
Rose Conway,
So, as my colleague said, the Residential Tenancies Tenancies, Student Rents and Other Protections COVID-19 Bill 2021 seeks to end the rip-off of students and their families. And I would first like to commend the USI and indeed my previous speaker, my own colleague Owen O'Brien, and his team for the work that they have done on this bill. I would also like to acknowledge all those in opposition, the 56 TDs who have already signed the bill. We are living through a housing crisis that has a real impact on access to third-level education, especially for people living outside the cities and the large towns. But despite having the highest fees in the EU, accommodation is, for many families, the biggest financial barrier to getting students to third-level education, particularly those from rural Ireland. And students are often on low-paid part-time work or rely on the support of their families, that their families can afford to give them. Students are treated different by landlords, particularly those in purpose-built student accommodation, where they are often asked to pay a full semester of rent in advance. But we have to be cognizant of the financial situation of both the students themselves, who haven't been able to get employment in the pandemic, and also on families, on parents and on siblings who have also lost employment. And we saw the other day from the figures released, I think it was from Social Justice Ireland or Vincent de Paul, where working families, where such a high number, I think it was a quarter of working families, are living in poverty. And these are the same people that we have allowed to be robbed, I would say, in the last year because of paying for something up front that they actually then were prevented in law from using. But around 30,000 students live in private provided purpose-built student accommodation. And when the pandemic hit last March, it exposed the severe injustices students face in the rental market. They were on the hook for the accommodation that they no longer needed, and the vast majority never received any refund. Now, since Fine Gael came into government, they have given 87 million in tax breaks to purpose-built student accommodation providers. And despite this huge amount of public money, these landlords, many of them, have refused to issue refunds. Now, I want to commend the landlords who actually did issue refunds straight away. During the summer, after the experience of the first wave, I and others repeatedly warned of the risks faced by student renters if the college was to move online again. And students were given the optimistic assessments and positive headlines instead, when they needed the government to be straightforward and realistic with them. Now, the Minister for Further and Higher Education, Simon Harris, on the 31st of August, said that students were treated a bit shabbily, and I agree with him, when colleges closed their doors at the start of the pandemic. And he went on to say, if ever there were further restrictions and colleges had to close, we needed to make sure that all students got refunded. Now, that was a month before it was announced that students would not be returning to campus. Then in October, after colleges had moved online and the reports of students again being denied refunds began flooding into all our offices, I asked the Minister how he would ensure the students receive refunds, and the answer was he had no powers directly available to him under the current legal framework for private accommodation. Then when I raised it with yourselves, Minister, and the housing officer, I was simply told that it was not within the remit of the department. So this is why I really want to commend the USI for this, and everybody who has worked on this bill, because government should have done this as emergency legislation in the first place. But it's never too late to do the right thing. Student renters were cast aside. They were overpromised and they were underprotected. And we can never, ever allow that to happen again, Minister. The aim of this bill is to ensure that students are not left in this position again. And if the bill becomes law, the students will be able to end a tenancy in purpose-built student accommodation by serving the landlord with the notice of the termination of 28 days, as we said, and that they would get refunds back. I think we really, really owe it to the students of Ireland and to their families to right the wrong that was done to them since the beginning of the pandemic. If one of us went into a shop and we paid over 500, 6, 7, 8, 9,000, as these families have been done. And then we were ordered to leave the shop without getting what we paid for, but told we would never get our money back. We would not accept it. So why should student renters be treated any different? There's a real opportunity here for us to work collectively across the House to put this right. Thank you, Minister.
Violet Ann Wynne.
I'm delighted to get the opportunity to speak on this important bill, and I think the fact that it has garnered such support from a wide range of opposition TDs, I believe 56 in total, shows just how vital this legislation is. So look, we know that rent continued to increase from the academic year 2019-2020 to 2020 to 2021, despite the pandemic exposing the unsustainable and twisted nature of accommodation inflation, as rents in the capital rose by 0.3% over this pandemic period, which also begs the question, where is this unresponsive upward spiral of growth going to end? There is no invisible hand regulating supply and demand. Rents continue to rise even amid a global pandemic. In 2020, Ireland was the 5th most expensive country in Europe to rent your home, proving again that this pandemic has had an alienating effect on Irish families. So when students were told to go home, prevented by law from using their accommodation, we know that a battle ensued. I know that a huge amount of Clare students were contacting my office at that time, and I remember just how distressed and confused that they were. They were just not getting fair play. These students and families were already struggling to meet rent demands for their accommodation, and this lack of fairness compounded the issue. Many have had to go to the likes of money lenders, for example, just to get by. We need to ensure that this does not happen again, and we need to ensure that student renters are given the same protection as other renters. This bill is needed to protect the rights of our students who haven't been afforded their entitlements as tenants, who have, as they say, been milked for all they've been worth for years. This bill, for example, will prevent landlords from charging 1 month's rent in advance. And I believe it is as good time as any to re-evaluate the precarious rental situations of many in our students and take concrete actions towards, firstly, rectifying the discrepancies in supply and secondly, making student accommodation accessible and affordable in the future. I call on all TDs to support this bill.
Ara, there's a myth in this country, and that myth is that there's free access to education, that anyone can go to third-level education, get a degree, and even apparently get a well-paid job. But all of that, unfortunately, is simply a myth. The issue much of the time is that universities actually rely on financing from students, be they international or EU students, to fund the activities of that university because they're just simply not adequately funded by this state. And if students do make it to university, no student should be seen as a cash cow. But there are many, many financial barriers to third-level education. And without even going into the detail of the likes of the student contribution that students have to pay, there's a simple, basic fact that for many, rents are simply out of reach for most ordinary students, and no more so than in Galway City, where I'm from, where we have the 2nd highest rents in the state. But this bill, and what I really like about this bill, is that this bill is specific in terms of students' needs, and that it looks at those challenges faced by students, and specifically those students who are in purpose-built student accommodation. And the strength of this bill actually lies in the fact that it has come from the students themselves, from their experiences and from their union. Now, last September, I remember very clearly, students were told to act like everything was normal, to put the deposit on their student accommodation, and then that same week they were told, oh wait, oh no, all the university lectures will actually be online. But of course, so many students had a situation where they put down that deposit and they didn't see that deposit again. And in one accommodation provider in Galway City, the Students' Union were actually dealing with 30 different refusals of a return to deposit because it was just simply left up to the landlord. And even this morning, I was speaking to one student who's been waiting 7 months now to get her deposit back, and she's basically given up. But this bill would legislate for that, and it would also mean that students can give 28 days' notice for those purpose-built accommodations. And that's really important, because we all know that life doesn't always work out the way we've planned, and some of these cost something like €7,000 a year, so it really is very important. So I'm glad to hear that everyone's going to be supporting this bill, and it's important it's enacted.
Just before I start, Republicans in Dundalk at this point in time are saying farewell to Francie Doran, a man from the north. Many from Belfast, like himself, settled in Dundalk due to the conflict, and they played a significant role in both Republican activism and also in community activism. So my thoughts are with Marion and his family at this point, and I just thought I needed to make mention of it. I commend Deputy Owen O'Brien and Rose Conway-Walsh and the USI in relation to dealing with an issue, and this is about giving protection to students. We have already heard it mentioned many times here in relation to students due to the pandemic that found themselves in a really, really difficult situation as regards huge deposits and not being able to get money back. This will give protections in relation to a decent time to present notice. It will ensure protection in relation to refunds, and it'll mean that we don't have the awful scenario of people having to put 3, 6 and 9 months' money together to give to a landlord to ensure that they have accommodation so that they can attend to college. There are already many, many obstacles in relation to people who can access the SUSI grant, those who can't access it, and many other things that's happened long before that, and many interventions that are needed from the state in relation to rectifying all of this. But this is a very, very simple bill, and I do welcome that governmental support and governmental support for the tenets of it. We just need to ensure that it will happen. My own town of Dundalk, we're obviously delighted that we have DKIT, but you have a case of we need to deal with the overall housing crisis, because we have people who work in the likes of PayPal who are able to bunch together. We're talking about people who can avail of HAP, those who can't avail of HAP, and students all fighting for a limited amount of rentals and all paying huge rents. We're talking $1,000, $1,200, $1,400. I know I've talked to the Minister before. We need to deal with that entire issue. We need to deal with the land bank issues that Louth County Council have. I welcome the support in relation to dealing with this issue for students, but we need to deliver on the housing crisis across the board.
Coalition G-Sporach the Rashka Sinn Féin Claire Curran.
And I want to begin by welcoming the government's support for this bill and by commending colleagues and the USI for their work in relation to this. And of course, this bill isn't just about removing very much that lump sum that parents and students are expected to pay at the beginning, but it's also about removing that barrier that is there. And there shouldn't be a student in this state who are unable to move to go to college because of the cost of accommodation, and we know it has been a major issue for students and for their parents and for their families for many years. So I welcome this bill here today. The large sums of money that parents and students are to pay up front, that is after much sacrifices made by parents and students to try and gather that money together well ahead of the college year, and that has been a huge difficulty. I dealt with a student who is in NUI Galway last year. The parents had paid €5,000 for his accommodation. The course went online, the accommodation was never used, and the provider refused to pay 1 red cent of that back, €5,000. And from speaking to colleagues and knowing students in other colleges, that actual 5,000 was quite low in respect of other accommodation providers and what they charge. So it was really difficult to actually have to go back to that family and say, sorry, you're not going to get any refund of €5,000, knowing what they had sacrificed in order to make that money and to allow their son to get to college. And I think we really need to see an end to that. And I remember the accommodation provider at that time telling me that government hadn't restricted the use of student accommodation in relation to the COVID restrictions, and therefore the accommodation could be used. Absolutely ridiculous. And I know in some cases now, a few years ago and even in the past, it was always the case that you might go into student-specific accommodation in the first year and then you would go on private rent for the second, third and fourth year if that was the case. And now that's even limited because obviously the cost of rent and the lack of availability. So students are staying in student-specific accommodation for longer. And just finally, I think it's so important that we have clarity for the students that will hopefully be going to college in September. We know these accommodation costs are looked for ahead of September, and we need clarity for these students and for their parents so that they're not put in a position where they lose thousands.
Thank you, Las Ceann Comhairle. And again, I'd like to start by thanking USI, and in particular the President, Lorna Fitzpatrick, and the Vice President for Campaigns, Craig McHugh, for all of the work that they've done in progressing this important piece of legislation. I would also like to thank all of the 56 opposition deputies who co-signed the legislation, my own colleagues in Sinn Féin, but also deputies from the Social Democrats, from Labour, from People Before Profit, Solidarity and Rise, and from Independence for Change. And also it's very heartening to see that this bill is passing through the House today unanimously. Every single deputy who has spoken both in favour of the spirit as well as the substance of the bill, and I think that's a very welcome fact. In particular, I want to welcome the commitments by both ministers for housing and for higher education to support this legislation, although I do want to urge just a small note of caution. The Minister for Housing mentioned a residential tenancies amendment bill. It is not in the priority list of legislation that was published last week, and therefore, while I know work on the heads of that bill is progressing, it's unlikely we'll see that until the early autumn. It's unlikely it will progress until later by the end of the year. And unfortunately, students don't have that time to wait. So what I would urge both the ministers who spoke today to do, but also members of the Oireachtas Housing Committee, is to allow this bill to progress to committee as a matter of urgency for us to undertake the necessary pre-legislative scrutiny, and if it's possible to pass this bill in advance of the residential tenancies bill from government in order to give students the protections they deserve as early as is possible. That would be the most preferable outcome. Having said that, we will always work with government on progressive changes to the Residential Tenancies Act, and I look forward to the heads of bill being published by the Minister whenever they are ready. Specifically, I suppose it's important for anybody watching this debate to fully understand that the passage of this bill today, unfortunately, does not mean these protections come in immediately, and therefore I would urge USI and students across the state to continue campaigning for the full enactment of this legislation. In fact, there's quite a lot of work for us to do to continue that. I do think, as other opposition deputies have said, this is a very good example of what happens when civil society, who are raising a real concern for the constituency they represent, engage with progressive politicians from a range of parties, table good quality legislation scrutinised and enhanced by the Office of Parliamentary Legislative Advice, and therefore leans on government to do something that it may well have done in its own time, but it will certainly now be forced to do at a much speedier pace. I'd also like to make just a couple of comments on Minister Harris's comments with relation to the student accommodation strategy. This is obviously an area of work that my colleague Rose Conway-Walsh leads out on, but given the fact that I have the opportunity to respond, I don't think my colleague will object. I absolutely welcome the admission by the Minister that there are significant flaws in the student accommodation strategy, the course that is now expiring. He is absolutely right. It always over-relied on private sector provision to the detriment of not-for-profit on-campus provision by universities and ITs. And he is absolutely right that the inability of ITs to borrow meant that they weren't able to provide on-campus accommodation. It's something actually myself and our party have been calling for government to take action on for about 3 years, and I genuinely welcome that. I think that could be very significant. However, that in and of itself will not allow the scale of on-campus or near-campus student accommodation to be provided. I mean, the Minister will know there is a shortfall in the government's own strategy of about 20,000 bed spaces that identified a 20,000 bed space shortfall at the start of the strategy, and notwithstanding an increase in provision, public and private, there was still to be a 20,000 bed shortfall by the end. So could I commend two other things to the Minister, and maybe he can discuss these with the Minister for Housing. The first is to look at some of the supports that are currently being provided to local authorities and approved housing bodies for the delivery of affordable cost rental accommodation. Similar funding streams could be provided by the Minister for Higher Education's department to assist universities and ITs to structure their loan arrangements in such a way that they can have longer maturities and therefore lower rents for students. Secondly, there are very significant capital provisions that are also provided for AHBs and approved housing bodies that reduce the overall borrowing cost by providing softer loans to be repaid at a further date to government. And I think a combination of some smart thinking about the financial underpinning of on-campus student accommodation by universities and ITs, if government was of a mind, could go a long way. So I want to thank deputies for supporting the bill, but urge people keep the campaign up and let's get this legislation passed by all houses, signed by the President, to give students the fair play they deserve as a matter of urgency.